reading the rest of the chapter here. Going to kind of cover the rest of the chapter, and really it's could be considered part 2 of what we looked at last week. If we are building off of the question that Ruth asks in verse number 10, which is where we finished last week with Ruth's overwhelmed attitude of gratefulness and appreciation, and realizing that Ruth was realizing that she was getting better than she expected, maybe better than she deserved, but better definitely than she had anticipated. And we come to kind of answer the question that Ruth asks in verse number 10. I'm going to give 2 reasons this morning why, to the reason for her question there. But we're really going to focus on verse, as we get down to just one of the verses, in verse number 12, and the phrase there at the end of there, under whose wings thou art come to trust. And this is an interesting phrase. It's a phrase that we will see again as we get into the book. We're going to see a play on this phrase, and if you know the rest of the story, how it turns out. And if you don't, then I won't spoil it for you, so you can actually come and learn this story as we go along. But it's a very beautiful story that has begun to unfold. What we also see here at the end of this is the bitter Naomi begins to see God's providence, how it has been unfolded. Something that dawned on me, and I had never really realized this. Again, this might just be one of the many things that I have finally come to realize that some of you have known for a long, long time. But, remember at the beginning, or at the end of chapter 1, when Naomi said, "Call me Mara." No one does that. No one calls her, and God especially continues to refer to her as Naomi. And I see a beautiful forgiveness here, and the bitterness when we think that it's over, when we think it's all done. We see God doesn't give up. He continues in the narrative that He is going to play out, not rather than the one that we think is going to play out. But that's for last week. And so if you were going to come last week or this week, you should have come last week. And so now we're on to something new. But we are going to begin there in verse number 10. And what I would like to do this morning is just kind of go through the verses and try to explain what's going on, and then at the end pull out what's been happening. If you've been coming and tracking what we've been studying there, then you're familiar with kind of where we are in the story. But just for those of you who maybe it's been a week or two and you've missed the narrative, or you were just not able to catch up to what we're doing, let me just kind of back up and remind you what happens here. Elimelech is a man that lived in Bethlehem, Judah. He had a wife, Naomi. He had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they moved to the country of Boaz because of a famine in the land of Bethlehem. And during that time, it was at least 10 years. We know that it was reported that at least 10 years were reported there. And during that time, Elimelech dies. During that time as well, Mahlon and Chilion marry girls from Moab, Moabites, and they were definitely enemies of Israel. And they marry 2 girls, Ruth and Orpah. During that time as well, Mahlon and Chilion die. Young men who die childless, and they leave behind, all 3 men leave behind a widow. And at the end of a famine in Bethlehem, Naomi hears that there is now bread, and she is going to make her way back to Bethlehem. And she takes with her, at least for the first part of her journey, she takes Ruth and Orpah. Halfway down the road, or however long she got, she decided that she didn't want to have them with her. She felt like maybe it was a constant reminder of all that she had lost, and so she asks the girls to go back home, and she convinces one, and Ruth makes a very big commitment, very notable words there at the end of chapter 1, as we are very familiar with it, as we've already taken time to look at. When we get to chapter number 2, and we see that they're back in Bethlehem, and they are going to, Ruth decides that she's going to go and glean in the fields and to pick up the leftover grain that the harvesters are going to leave behind. Notice what she says if you want to peek back into verse number 2. And she says here, "Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace." So Ruth here was not looking for a handout, but rather she was looking for grace. She was looking for favor. She's looking for an opportunity to work in a place where someone might show her grace. We see this wish, if you will, come to pass as she happens to land in a field of a man named Boaz, who happens to be a relative, who happens to be a potential redeemer, who happens to be the greatest guy in the whole town, and she just so happens to get there in his field. And we see God working in the background here. And what we're beginning to see now, though, is that God begins to move from the background to the forefront, and what he is doing becomes a little less mysterious. And we see how at least the characters of the story begin to awaken to the fact that what God is doing. Now, for us, we can look and see God working the whole time. But in our own lives, we don't have that advantage. Most of the time, we are as in the dark as Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz were. We see what we consider coincidence until it really comes together, or maybe years down the road, and we look back and go, you know what, I guess that there was some connection after all, and we see that the hand of God is faithful even when we cannot see it. Well, we get to verse number 10, and Boaz has begun to show Ruth some incredible generosity and some incredible kindness, and he's not done yet. We're going to see, as we've already read this morning. But for the first part of Boaz's kindness towards her, Ruth asks this question in verse 10, "Why have I found grace in thy eyes?" Now, this is exactly what she wanted to find. But when she finally gets it, she asks Boaz, "Why? Why are you doing this? This is more than should be done for me." Of course, this is what she wanted. But this is more than she had anticipated. Maybe she was going out thinking that she was maybe going to get some grain, but not necessarily any kindness. She was going to have to fight for it, and probably have to put up with the jeering and the sneers and the insults that would be hurled her way as she picked up whatever was left on the ground. And definitely without the permission, if you will, the blessing of being there. I think that Ruth is intended to go out and be comfortable being unwelcome, but because she wanted the food so badly for her and her mother-in-law, she was willing to put up with that. But that's totally the opposite of what she actually received. And so she is overwhelmed. And she asks this question here in verse 10, "Why have I found grace? Why have you taken notice of me? Why do you pay attention to me? I'm a foreigner. I'm a stranger. I'm a widow. I'm poor. I'm a nobody. And you, who are somebody in this town, have taken notice of me." We get to these answers that Boaz gives her in verse number 11. He says there in verse 11, "It hath fully been showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother in the land of thy nativity, and are come unto a people which thou knewest not heretofore." He says here, "I know all that you've done for Naomi. I've heard all about you." So what we find here is that Boaz is at least familiar with this person named Ruth. He's never met her until this point, but he's heard all about her. Small town, we know what that's like, right? We know about what happens, and maybe you don't know the person specifically, but you know about what happens. That never ceases to amaze me. There are a handful of people that seem to know things that happen before they happen, and they're the ones you find out, the juicy stuff, or the facts at the very least. But Boaz has heard through the rumor mill of this girl from Moab who has made her way into Bethlehem with Naomi, and he has finally met her, but he tells her, "This is why I'm doing this. I have heard what you've done for your mother-in-law. I've heard how you left your family. I heard how you left your country behind, and I heard how you've cared for Naomi all along the way, and we all know Naomi is no longer the sweet and pleasant woman that she left, and God bless you for what you have done and putting up with this woman." And he says as much later on in the next verse. He says, "Lord, recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust." Two things there, he says. May God repay you for what you've done, and may God reward you. He says here, the first part there is restitution, kind of for what you've lost. Think about what Ruth had that she no longer has. She had a family. She had someone to provide for her. She had a husband. And Boaz is wishing her that God would, he's praying for a blessing on her, that God would repay her for what she had lost. Very similar to what Naomi had blessed Ruth and Orpah when she tried to get them to go back home, that God would give them both husbands and someone to care for them and nurture them because of how great they have been to their family that they have. But then he says here that I pray that God would reward you things that she hadn't lost, things that she had not yet had. I can't help but think that maybe he's wishing her to be a mother. Because every woman at this time, every wife, every girl wanted to be a mother. That was how there was a disgrace to a family line that ended abruptly with no heir, with no son to carry on the family name. And this is where Naomi and Ruth find themselves. Basically, their family tree would disappear. Ruth has kind of accepted the fact she'll probably be a widow. No Bethlehemite is going to marry a foreign woman, and Naomi feels that she's too old to get married, and they've kind of resigned themselves over to poverty and widowhood, and going to just kind of survive, scrape by for the rest of their lives. And Boaz here is saying that he prays that God would not only repay and restore what Ruth lost, but also give her what she had never had. Very similar to what we see in the story of Job, when God gave him back all the animals that he had lost and more, and he gave him even more children. God blessed him with things that he lost as well as things that he had never had. And he makes an incredible statement in verse number 12 there. He says that under whose wings thou art come to trust. He's using some imagery here of a bird that provides refuge for her chicks. Under the wings, under the shelter. It's an image of provision, of protection, of care, and of comfort. And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. After, as Ruth continues this conversation with him, then she says in verse 13, "Let me find favor in thy sight, my Lord, for thou hast comforted me, and for thou hast spoken friendly unto thy handmaid, though I be not like unto one of thy handmaid." She says three things here. She says, number one, this let me find favor, may I continue to find favor with you. I have found favor. I don't know why I found favor. Even the reasons that you've given me maybe don't completely settle in, but I pray that I'll continue to find favor in your sight. She says, you've comforted me. You've spoken kindly to me. And the emphasis here on me. You speak kindly to everybody. We saw the way that he interacted with his employees. He's a good guy. He's a great guy. He's a guy that I like, and I say I would like to know this Boaz kind of a guy. I would like to have a friend like Boaz. I would like to have an employer like Boaz. I would like to have this guy around as a church member, as a friend, as a family member. And we see the Ruth and we feel the same way. But Ruth is saying here, you have been kind to me, a foreigner. You've been good to me. I'm a stranger. I'm a nobody. There's nothing that you gain from being kind to me. This is all out of the goodness of your heart. There's no reward here. There's no advantage that you're going to have to show me kindness. You're losing. You're all giving and getting nothing in return. And you've been kind to me. You've comforted me. And she says this statement at the end there, I'm your servant. Even though I'm not even one of your servants. She says, this is who I am. I am your servant. She's being humble here, but saying it, recognizing the fact, I'm not even equal to one of your servants. And the word that she uses here is describing one of the lowest forms of servants that Boaz would have had. She's not saying that I'm like one of your big servants here. I'm the lowest. I'm the handmaiden. There's references throughout the Old Testament to the limited privileges and rights that these types of servants had. And Ruth says, I'm not even there. Very, very reminiscent of the prodigal son is when he was sitting in the pigsty and he said, you know what, I don't deserve to even be my father's son anymore. I want to be one of your hired servants, and lowering himself on the importance scale. And Ruth is here taking the lowest position available and saying, I'm not even there. I'm your servant. I'm going to serve you, and I'm showing you honor and respect, but I'm not even at the stature, at the level of your lowest servant. I am not even on the totem pole, let alone being low on it. I'm not even on the pole at all. And she says here that you've comforted me and you've encouraged me. Boaz at mealtime then brings her more kindness and invites her to share a meal with him. Has he already fulfilled his obligation? Yes. But he's as far beyond fulfilling an obligation or responsibility to take care of a poor woman. All the scriptures told him to do was let her glean in the corners of his field, and basically, as we've talked about already, they were not allowed to go back for a second time through and make sure they got everything. Anything that was left behind had to be left for the poor. And so this is all that Boaz had to do. But yet at mealtime, he's already showed her kindness, and he adds on to this and says, hey, would you come and eat with us? He's brought food. He has people probably preparing food for him and sitting down and offering her this courtesy. And notice here it says at mealtime, come thou hither. And eat of the bread, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar. This is when we think of vinegar, we're thinking that's gross. I don't want to dip my bread in vinegar. I want to dip it in like butter or something. But this is a sauce that they would have used that was both refreshing to them and it kind of made the bread easier to swallow there. And he says here, and she sat beside the reapers, and he reached her parched corn. Now, if we're following, you're thinking about it. Are we reading corn or barley or grain, or what are we talking about? We see later on it's kind of a generic word, but we're in this barley harvest there. And I was looking at this because I was thinking, when I'm thinking corn too, I'm thinking corn if I'm thinking corn, I'm thinking corn has just been shucked. And then we're just going to eat it? Like, no, this is not corn on the cob. But I looked, it's actually a thing, and it's like supposed to be a good thing. I'm not going to try it because it doesn't sound like it's that good to me. But it would be the equivalent of taking these grains and roasting them and maybe seasoning them, and then they would just eat them right there. And it was something that would fill her up, and it was something that was plentiful that he had not only for himself and for his employees, but he says, here's some bread, here's something to dip your bread in, here's something to drink, and here's something as well to fill you and to satisfy you. And notice it says, and she did eat, and was sufficed. He gave her plenty, and says, and left. Now, it's not talking about that she got up and left, but it's saying that it's describing the rest of the food that she had. She had leftovers. And Boaz lets her keep the leftovers. She took home a doggy bag from the delicious food that he had been given. Why? Because she had a mother-in-law at home. That's the whole reason that she was out, is to get some food for her as well. And she's sitting here thinking, I'm full, my belly's full, probably not expecting to have another meal like this later on. My belly's full. I'm taking this home and sharing some with Naomi, and she does. And when she was risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves and reproach her not. Now, Boaz makes good on his promise that he had made to Ruth earlier in saying, I'm going to let you stay in my fields, and I want you to stay by my girls, and I want you to stay in the safety of the number, but I also am going to tell my guys to watch out for you and to keep an eye on you, but also to keep their hands off you and to be quiet as far as their what they feel about you. Basically, you're going to have a good work environment, Ruth. You're not going to have to just trudge through this and deal with it in order to get the food. I'm going to make the work environment for you as healthy and as positive and as cheerful as I can. But then he goes further than what he told Ruth he was going to do. Because not only does he say, guys, I want you to leave her alone, but he says, I want you to leave some for her on purpose. He says there in verse number 15, let her glean even among the sheaves and reproach her not. And, verse 16, let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her, and leave them, that she may glean them, and rebuke her not. So he's not only is she let alone to glean without harassment and abuse, she's also they're instructed to leave purposefully some of that which they have harvested in order for her to pick up. So this is a fourth category, if you will, of her gleaning, because she was already had permission to go into the corners of the field. She already had permission to pick up that which they had dropped unintentionally. She had already had permission to pick up that which they had failed to glean. Maybe they left a few stalks here and there, and she was able to go and get those. But now they were instructed to take from what was already on the wagon. It was already bundled up, and pull some of those out. And I can't help but think he's telling her, and do this on the sly. I want you to accidentally drop some. Maybe you got the clumsy employee to be in the back of the wagon and say, just leave Jeff alone and let him do his thing, and don't yell at him this time when he spills. Okay? And if there's a Jeff in here, I'm sorry. But I'm not saying you're clumsy. I know one of Jeff, and he's not. But that's what he's instructing them to do. He's like, hey, guys, I want you to be kind to her. You're going to be my hands and feet now. I'm going to be kind to her and giving her this opportunity. You're going to actually be the one to deliver it to her. And his kindness begins to just overwhelm. I like Boaz. I want this kind of guy around. I want a guy who's going to send me home from a meal at his house with leftovers. I want a guy who's going to give me opportunities to better myself. And I want a guy who's going to give me bonuses every once in a while. This guy is awesome. I mean, if you're an employee and you say, I want this kind of a boss. And if you're a boss, I mean, here's an excellent role model for how to interact with your workers and how to have a happier workplace. We're not going to spend time there, but there's definitely and I don't think it's the main idea of here, but there's definitely some to glean there, if you will, from Boaz here. And in verse 17 it says that Ruth continues on. She gleans in the field until evening. And it says here, and beat out that which she had gleaned. And it was about an ephah of barley. There's a lot of disagreement on what an ephah is. How many of you know what an ephah is? Yeah, me neither. And so I'm Googling it, and I'm reading it, and I'm looking in this commentary, and I'm looking in this dictionary, and everybody has a different understanding of what an ephah is. So it's like a liter, but we don't use liters, and it's like a bushel, and none of us understand bushels. Well, maybe some of you do. I don't want to speak for all of you, but some of you might. And so I spent a long time trying to figure out what in the world's an ephah. I mean, is that like a cup full? Is that like a barrel full? Is that a basket full? What is this? And the best I could come up with here to really just keep it kind of conservative is between 30 and 50 pounds. If you can imagine carrying a bag of grain that after she's collected it all, she processes it all, and it's between 30 and 50 pounds. This is not a little basket full. This is not a pocket full. This is quite a load. And so not only has Ruth worked all day in the field, she's tired, she's got to carry it home. But this is a happy burden. This is a wonderful burden to have. At the very least, this was enough food to, I know some of you have Bibles with notes in it, and I can see you looking down saying, is that what mine says? Because everybody's going to say something different, I can tell you. If you have notes in your Bible, it probably says something different. It's enough food to feed two ladies for at least a couple of weeks. Put it that way. Now, when you think about what gleaning is not some romantic idea of going out and it's not something that we would think, oh yeah, that's a wonderful thing to do. You know, that's a great first-time job, and it's a great entry level. It's, you know, like getting a job at Dunkin' Donuts or Tim Hortons. No. This is worse than that. This would be, I heard one preacher say, this would be equivalent of collecting cans. Going out and dumpster diving and looking anywhere you can for enough aluminum cans to turn in to get enough money to buy some food. You're not getting ahead, folks. And yet this time, she is able to come home on the first day with enough food to last her and Ruth for weeks. Plus, she's got already cooked food ready to be eaten right now. I mean, she's got a ton of food. And she's bringing this home, verse number 18. And she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. And she brought forth and gave to her that she had reserved after she was sufficed. There's those leftovers. And verse 19, and her mother-in-law said unto her, where hast thou gleaned today? She's amazed. She knew that Ruth would come home maybe with a little bit, but she has no expectation of what Ruth is bringing home now. This is way beyond. I'm thinking, who did you rob? Where did you get this? You know, if you send your kids out for something, or you send your husband out, right? And we guys were sent to the store for milk, and we come back with chips and cookies and ice cream. There's dairy in that, and maybe there's some milk, maybe there's not. But it's like, where'd you get all this? Where we get in trouble if we're asked that question. But Ruth here is not in trouble. Where'd you get all this? Where'd you glean today? Where'd you work? Where wroughtest thou? Blessed be he that did take knowledge of thee. She doesn't even give Ruth a chance to answer right away. She's just like, she realizes somebody has been really, really good to you. She has no idea who it is yet, but she says, blessed be this guy who took notice of you. This is what she was desiring for Ruth. This is what Ruth was desiring. We look back up in verse 10. It's the same idea that Ruth says to Boaz here. Why would you take knowledge of me? Why would you take notice of me? And Naomi is echoing this thing. I don't know who he is, but this guy, may God bless him. This guy is awesome. This guy's been wonderful. And Naomi, verse number, lost my place here. Verse number 19 there, and she showed her mother-in-law with whom she had wrought, and said, the man's name with whom I wrought today is Boaz. This is the first time when Naomi, there's a little switch that clicks in her mind. It's not completely illuminated to her yet, but something clicks like Boaz. Now, at this point, this helps us to realize that up to this point, Ruth is the only one in the dark, or at least she's the one furthest in the dark, because Ruth has known about this guy named Boaz, but she doesn't know that she's related to him. Naomi knew of a man named Boaz, but didn't say, hey, Ruth, Boaz is out there somewhere. He's got fields. He's related to us. He'll probably show you the greatest kindness than anybody else. She didn't say that. But now, when Ruth reveals the name of the man who has blessed her so greatly, it clicks. And notice what it says there, verse number 20. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said unto her, the man is near of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen. She realizes that she begins to see God's hand has been in this all along. Not that God is beginning to work, but that she's beginning to see that God is at work. And she gives thanks, recognizing now that God's hand is not in opposition to her, but that God has been blessing her and providing for her, even in her doubt and bitterness. May he be blessed by the Lord. There's some interesting discussion over the way that this phrase is put in the Scriptures, even in the way that it's put out into the Hebrew. The way that she says here, may he be, blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness. And there's some discussion on the pronoun who to whom it refers. Is it referring back to the he of the Lord, or is it referring to the Lord? So some would say that she's talking about blessed be. It's another continued blessing on Boaz here, saying that may he be blessed by the Lord because his kindness hasn't forsaken the living and the dead, meaning he's been good to me and you, the living, and he continues to honor the dead, Elimelech and Mahlon, our husbands, who were his kinsmen. He continues to honor them by providing for us. Or, and what I happen to think it means, is she's using the pronoun to refer to the Lord. The Lord hasn't forsaken us. The Lord has continued his kindness toward us. Either way, whichever side of the fence you fall on, with either meaning, we begin to see that Boaz is the man that God is going to use to bless Ruth and to care for them. And he's going to be the instrument by which God provides for Naomi and Ruth. God has not left off his blessing. God has not left off his kindness to them. And we see that Boaz is the man who gets to be the instrument that God uses to show those things. So I think both ways it would probably be true. We continue on, and it says there, Ruth says in verse 21, he said unto me also, thou shalt keep fast by my young men until they have ended all my harvest. It's kind of a weird time to make this statement, but what she's saying here is, not only did I get a lot today, I'm allowed to go back tomorrow. And not only am I going back tomorrow, I'm going back for the next several days. I'm going back until the end of all my harvest. Not just until the end of this harvest. I'm going back until all of the harvest is done. Boaz had more than barley out there. And we see that if we keep reading in verse number 23, so she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean unto the end of barley harvest and of wheat harvest, and dwelt with her mother-in-law. She stays there, she gleans. According to the calendar then, it would have been, the barley harvest would have been our April or May. And then she was there for a couple of weeks. And then a couple of weeks later would have been the wheat harvest. And so she was given a job that was lasting for a long time. And basically, as long as Boaz was out there in the fields reaping, Ruth had a place to work. Ruth had a place to provide for herself. And we see that for the next few weeks at least, there's a bit of a gap, if you will, from chapter 2:23 to 3:1. We see a gap of a couple of weeks there because nothing changes. Everything just begins to stay the same. And she's going to her job, she's gleaning, she's enjoying. There's no other mention of some great productivity, great blessing, like he's giving her extra things like that. But we do see that Boaz has begun to be used by God to take care of two widows, to take care of two kind of distant relatives, and God is using them. But I want to go back to verse number 12. And I want to ask the reason for Boaz's generosity and kindness. The reason that we go to the end of the chapter is because I want to develop the full understanding of Boaz's generosity and kindness. But I have to ask the question, why? Just like Ruth did in verse 10, why are you being so good to me? Why would he be so good to Ruth? Did he think that she was a potential mate? Was he being nice to her because he was flirting with her? Because he wanted to impress her? Because he wanted to marry her? There's no indication of that. In fact, later on, as we see, spoiler alert, if you don't want to know, close your ears, but he's going to say later on, he goes, you could have gone after the young guys. I think Boaz was significantly older than Ruth, and when she finally says, I'm interested if you're interested, he says, oh, I've been interested, but I didn't think that there was a chance because I'm so much older than you. I don't think Boaz is showing generosity and kindness, and the very reason that he gives here in verse number 11 is because of her work ethic. He's impressed by her work ethic. She wasn't lazy, but she was willing to do whatever was necessary, not only to care for herself, but to care for Naomi. She's not one to sit on the couch and say, well, I'm back in Bethlehem taking care of Naomi. Naomi, now what? She has the idea in the beginning of chapter 2, hey, I'm going to get up and I'm going to go pick up cans. I'm going to go do whatever I need to do. I probably can't find a job because of my foreign status, but I can pick up cans. I can go and pick up grain in the field. There's a law that allows me to do that. I can go do that. I'll go do that. I'll come back. And she leaves Naomi behind. Doesn't involve Naomi in that work. She takes it upon herself. She has the initiative. And Boaz sees that. And he likes that. He's impressed by that. Not because, hey, that's marriage quality, but that's just admirable for any person. I like Ruth a lot. She is willing to risk her own safety and her own comfort because she wanted to care and provide for another. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. John says there that when we put our life on the line for another, and ultimately talking of Christ here, but here Ruth is putting her life on the line in order to get food on the table for Naomi. It's great love. It's an incredible love. And yet, Ruth really has no obligation to her except for what she has committed herself to, and she follows through with that. She's not looking for a handout. She's not demanding her rights, not looking for welfare, not looking for what's the least I can do to get by. She's looking for favor. She's looking for an opportunity to work. She's looking for grace. And Boaz blessed Ruth because of his desire that God would repay her and reward her for what she had done, for her work. That's Boaz's reason for kindness. But then I have to ask the second question of Ruth's why. Why would you do this? I've been asking the question for 2 chapters now. Why would you do this? How could you do this? How could Ruth leave everything behind for a bitter old woman? How could she leave her home and her family, her country, her culture, her land of her fathers, everything with what she was familiar, and go to a foreign land, a place that was not welcome her, a place that for a long time had finally had been without, and now they finally had some. Can you imagine being an Israelite, someone who lived in Bethlehem at that time? You've gone for at least 10 years with famine, so you've been scraping by. You're not excited for new people to come in and take away what you've been waiting and working for so long. But that's Ruth. Why would she do this? Why would she commit herself to live a life with a self-admitted, bitter, angry woman? Why would she risk mistreatment and rejection? How could she live a life of widowhood and poverty and be okay with that? How could she do that? Why would she do that? Why risk safety, being alone in the fields of Bethlehem? She didn't know that Boaz would be out there. She didn't know that what would happen to her as she left work for work that morning. She didn't know how she would return or if she would return, but she went anyway. Really, we've already seen her reason why. We saw it in verse 16 of chapter 1. We see it again. Boaz recognizes it and states it in verse number 12. Under whose wings thou art come to trust. If you want to go back to verse 16 of chapter 1 and see Ruth's commitment. Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For where thou goest, I will go. Where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people. And here it is, thy God, my God. She's committed. It sounds like a commitment to Naomi, but it's much deeper than that. It's much bigger than that. Her commitment is to God. Her commitment is to the God of Naomi and the God of Israel. Not to the people of Israel, not to the person Naomi, but to the God that has provided for them. And something in Naomi's life or in what they had taught her in the few years that she was married to Mahlon got her interested, made her aware of the one true God, the God of Israel. And when it came time to make a decision, she said, you know what, I'm going back with you. Even when Naomi said, go back to your own gods, go back to your own land, go back to your own familiarity, she says, no, I'm going back to your God. I'm going back to your people. And Boaz says here, it says the full reward given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. He says you have fully relied on God to protect and to provide for you. That's how she could leave her family. She could leave her father and her mother. She could leave those around her who would no doubt care for her, because she had put her trust in a God who would care for her, who would provide for her. Jesus uses the same metaphor in Matthew and Luke when he talks about Jerusalem. He stands at a place where you can see Jerusalem, and he says, Jerusalem, you kill the prophets. I've desired to gather you together like a hen would gather her chicks. I want to keep you inside of my safety and my shelter. And he says, but you would not. You wouldn't do it. I've desired to Israel, but you would not. And because of that, the very next verse he pronounces the judgment on them, because they have failed to seek the shelter and the refuge under the shadow of God's wings. This idea of coming to trust, coming to seek refuge, means that it's a process. It's not overnight. It's not something that happens automatically or instantaneously, but over time. And through these events, we see that this is what is produced in Ruth. It produced in Naomi bitterness, but in Ruth, the same events produced trust in God. It drew her closer to God. We can see almost the difference between the two ladies, because they both experienced the same event, and yet for one, it drove her further from God, and for the other one, it drew her to God. She realized, I've lost everything in this life. I want God. I want the God of Israel. Nothing that I have is going to make up for what I've lost. I want that. I want that God. I want that relationship. I want His protection. I want His care. I want His provision. And she seeks that. John Piper says, Ruth was able to leave the refuge of her father and mother in Moab because she found a far superior refuge under the wings of God. He continues and says that she esteemed God's protection superior to all others. She has set her heart on God for hope and joy. See, Ruth was committed to Israel's God, not devoted necessarily to Naomi, but to Naomi's God. And under His wings of protection, Ruth finds refuge, provision, peace, security, hope, confidence, living her life out. The Psalms mention many, many times this phrase, this idea, this metaphor, if you will, of shelter under the wings of God. I put them in your notes, and I'd like to encourage you to read through them this week and think about it. Even there's some questions at the end to kind of just help you digest this a little further. And I'd like for you to really take some time, but I do want to read a few of them for you this morning. In Psalm 36, in verse 5, we read, Thy mercy, O Lord, is in the heavens, and Thy faithfulness reacheth unto the clouds. Thy righteousness is like the great mountains. Thy judgments are a great deep. O Lord, Thou preservest man and beast. How excellent is Thy loving kindness, O God. Therefore the children of men put their trust under the shadow of Thy wings. There's a great song about that. Every time I read it, I think of that song, Your Love, O Lord. And I love that song. Psalm 57, verse 1, Be merciful unto me, O God, be merciful unto me, for my soul trusteth in thee. Yea, in the shadow of thy wings I will make my refuge until these calamities be overpassed. We find that in the shadow of God's wings there is mercy. That's what Ruth needed. That's what the psalmist needed. That's what we need. We find it in the shadow of God's wings. We see help and protection are in the shadow of God's wings. In Psalm 33, Behold, the eye of the Lord is upon them that fear Him, upon them that hope in His mercy, to deliver their soul from death and to keep them alive in famine. Our soul waiteth for the Lord. He is our help and our shield, for our heart shall rejoice in Him, because we have trusted in His holy name. Let thy mercy, O Lord, be upon us, according as we hope in thee. I brought out this passage a week or so ago in talking about how she was able to make this commitment, and even the terminology, the words that are used here are reminding me, at least, of the famine and the way that they trusted and they hoped in God. But we see here that God looks favorably on those who fear Him and on those who hope in His mercy. We see in Psalm 91, and I've just put 4 verses there. I'm going to read 4 verses, but I'd like to encourage you to read the entire chapter this week, because it really just continues to develop what he says at the beginning. He says, He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In Him will I trust. Surely He shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler and from the noisome pestilence. He shall cover thee with His feathers, and under His wings shalt thou trust. He covers us like a mother hen covers her babies. It doesn't mean that it makes all the rain go away. It just means that I have a place to be sheltered from the rain. It doesn't make all the danger go away. You continue reading Psalm 91, it talks about it. From the shadow of the wings, he describes what he sees out there, and he sees danger, and he sees problems, and he sees worry. But from the shadow of the wings, he's okay with it. He deals with it because of where he is. It doesn't make all the bad circumstances go away, but it helps him cope with it under the shadow of his wings. We see in Psalm 17, show thy my marvelous loving kindness, O thou that savest by thy right hand them which put their trust in thee from those that rise up against them. Keep me as the apple of the eye. Hide me under the shadow of thy wings. We see also that there's rejoicing under the shadow of God's wings. Psalm 63:7, because thou hast been my help, therefore in the shadow of thy wings will I rejoice. Finally, we see that there's God's pleasure in the shadow of wings. In the shadow of His wings, the Lord taketh pleasure in them that fear Him, those that hope in His mercy. God is honored and He is pleased when we rest in Him, when we look to Him for our provision, when we look to Him for our comfort and for our care and for our protection and for everything. That honors God. That pleases God. It's in the shadow of God's wings that Ruth was able to leave everything behind. She was able to leave all and then give all. How could she do that? How could she do both of those? Leave everything that she knew because of the shadow of God's wings. She had come to trust. She was able to give all that she had. Why? Because of where she was, in the shadow of God's wings. In the security of God's shadow, Ruth found all she needed, and she would there find more than she expected. Really, what we begin to see is that Boaz's prayer for her has already been answered. He says, I pray that you'll get back that which you've lost and more. We find that in the shadow of God's wings, that's exactly what happens to her. Later on, she'll get more than she ever imagined. And we will be blessed because Ruth dwelt in the shadow of God's wings. What I like about this is that Ruth, being a Moabite, proves to me, proves to you, that the refuge of God's wings is not just for Israel. It's not just for the good people. Think about when Jesus stood on the place there and looked over Jerusalem, and he said, and he basically bemoans that Jerusalem, he wanted them. He wanted to protect them. He wanted to gather them under his wings, and they would not. He said that to Jerusalem. But it's not just for Jerusalem, because we see here Ruth's example. A Gentile, a Moabite, tells me, a Gentile, an American, a Gentile, that the refuge of God's wings is not just for them. It's for me. It's for anyone who will come to God and seek refuge. It's for anyone who will come and seek provision and His protection and His care and His blessing and stop looking for it in every other place and say, God, in Thee, O Lord, do I trust. Let me never be ashamed. God is pleased and honored when we do that. We look to Him. We find that there's a place for all who seek refuge in the shadow of His wings.